You don't control outcomes or circumstances or stock markets or industry indexes. And you don't have to be in the perfect job, because you're probably not in the perfect job to do all of the perfect things that you perfectly want to do, with the perfect strategy and the perfect ideas and the perfect people around you to do all of the perfect things to make the world perfect. It's that you live your whole life towards Him, even and maybe especially your work life towards Him. Because you trust the one who trusted you with the talent He's entrusted to you today. If you got a Bible, meet me in Matthew 25 today. Matthew 25 is where we're going to be this morning. You just heard we're continuing. This is the second half of a series on work we've called I Need a Vocation, where we're talking about how work in the plan of God is a lot more than just something designed to occupy us between the moments that God really cares about during our week. That work is an essential part of God's plan for our lives. In fact, if you were here last week, you saw work is literally the first word on God in the Bible. Before He reveals Himself to us in any other way, God reveals Himself to us as a worker. But not only that, it's not just the first word on God, it's also the first word from God. God gives us a command or a blessing as it regards work. The very first words He speaks to the people He's created. It's how God reveals Himself to us first. It's also how God shows up in flesh. We talked about how it matters that when Jesus shows up on the scene to show us what God is like, show us what it's like to be perfectly human. He spends the vast majority of His adult years going to work every single day at an everyday job. Whether you work at a church like me, or you work in a corporation, or you work in a home, or a hotel, or a restaurant, or a classroom, whether you do manual labor, or mental labor, or what feels a lot more like menial labor. Your work matters. It matters to God. When we design systems or structures or solve problems or manage people or manufacture products or account for details or hold back threats to the world or nourish people or nourish places to help them become the absolute best that they can be, we're doing the work of God that He's entrusted and employed us and called us to do. So how do we get work right? And maybe especially if we're in a less than perfect occupation. We have a less than perfect job around less than perfect people. The less than clear vision about how our work connects to God's work in the world. Today I want us to look in the New Testament at a story that's probably familiar to you, at least in some ways. If nothing else, you've heard a quote from this story at a funeral, or perhaps on Facebook, as people do tributes to people that have passed away. We imagine them standing before God and hearing the words, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Well, that quote comes from a story Jesus told. It has to do with how we invest our lives. But you may not have ever noticed this about that story. Think about this. When Jesus paints a picture about what the kingdom of heaven is like, he describes it as a story not using the metaphor of something that happens within a church, as important as what happens within a church is. He describes the kingdom of heaven with an image painted in the context of everyday work in the workplace. So here's the question for this morning, why we started with Michael Scott. Will you hear well done with the work you do this week? And if you're not sure, is there a way you could be? Matthew chapter 25, beginning in verse 14. Look at the story with me. Jesus is talking about the kingdom of heaven and says again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. Okay, so that's just the background of the story. Think about what you have just as Jesus sets up this parable. You've got a worker, don't you? You have a worker that's done good and fruitful work, who commissions, actually this passage says calls, some servants, some employees. He gives 3 people a vocation. You see that? And what does he tell them to do? He tells them to take the fruit of his work and go to work with it. Okay, now pause for just a second. Does that sound at all familiar? If you were here last week, it should sound a little bit familiar. First introduction to the main character in the story is to be introduced to them as a worker. And the first word within the story is for him to call the workers to take the fruit of his work and go to work with it and go to work on it. That sounds like page 1 of the Bible, doesn't it? Jesus is doing that on purpose. If you follow the arc, the story of the Bible, that shouldn't surprise you. God is at work in the world, rescuing the world and redeeming the world and reordering the world and restoring the world and his people in the world and employing them to join him in his work in the world. So it shouldn't surprise us here that themes from the first ideal show up when Jesus is describing the work that God is currently doing in the world and what it looks like to live towards a future ideal. And yet here in the middle of a city, Jesus doesn't use landscaping as the metaphor. He doesn't even use carpentry. He uses the illustration of a successful business person and 3 financial planners or hedge fund managers. And look how the story goes. Verse 15, to one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and another 1 bag, each according to his ability. And then he went on a journey. Okay, our translation says bags of gold. If you grew up in church, you probably heard this called the parable of the talents. That's the actual translation of that word there. But talent in Jesus' day meant something different than what talent means perhaps in our day. Talent was a denomination of money, and it was actually the largest denomination of money that people used in their currency in Jesus' day. So you might talk about somebody giving someone 5 Benjamins. It would have kind of the same idea, but you would miss the scale of what a talent was. Historians tell us that a talent was the equivalent of 15 years' wage for the ordinary worker. Okay, so give you a little sense of scale there. I don't know what ordinary worker looks like, but in Fort Worth last year, the median household income was $68,000. Okay, now that's household, but if you take that as ordinary, $68,000, and you multiply that by 15, you get a cool $1 million for 1 talent. So we're talking about real money here, and that becomes important to the story as the story goes on. Jesus says this businessman diversifies his portfolio among 3 different financial planners, and then he goes on a journey. Also important to notice, traveling in Jesus' day was a little different from traveling in our day. Like in our day, we lose our mind if our flight's delayed and we miss our arrival time or our departure time by a few hours, like worst case scenario, a couple of days. But in Jesus' day, if you were traveling on a journey, and especially if you were traveling by sea, we even have some examples of this in the book of Acts. If you miss your departure time or your arrival time, it's not just a couple of hours or maybe even a couple of days. You could miss your arrival by a whole season. Like, sorry, we've got some mechanical issues and it's going to be fall before you get home. So this manager is going on a journey and he doesn't know, and they don't know exactly when he'll return. These guys have a clear vocation from the master, but they have no real certainty how long they're going to be in their current occupation. That makes sense? All setting the context and the stage for the story. The story continues, verse 16. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who'd received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who'd received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I've gained 5 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. The man with 2 bags of gold also came. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I've gained 2 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. Then the man who'd received 1 bag of gold came. Master, he said, I knew you were a hard man, harvesting where you haven't sown, gathering where you haven't scattered seed. So, and what do you expect after all of the excuses start? You expect it to get pretty bad, don't you? Like, so I knew all of this about you, and so I need to tell you I lost everything. Or I lost everything, and even worse, I went double or nothing, and now you owe money, master. Look how it goes. So I was afraid, and I hid your gold in the ground. See, here's what belongs to you. His master replied, you wicked, lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I'd not sown and gather where I've not scattered seed? Well, then you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers, so at least when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. Take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags, for whoever has will be given more. They will have abundance. Whoever doesn't have, even what they have will be taken from them. And throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness, where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Obviously, ultimately a picture of eternal separation from God, but it's an immediate picture there at the end, isn't it, of regret and frustration, and a person on the outside of the master's work looking in. And again, that sounds like the original story, doesn't it? There are echoes of Eden and the exit of Eden right there in that story, what happened in the garden. So put it all together, the parable is pretty simple. And the point of the parable is pretty simple. Jesus is inviting us to live our whole story in light of a bigger story. The story of the work that God is doing and doing in the world. But you can't get away from explicitly seeing your work story within this story, can you? This is a parable, this is a story about work. And there are a couple of details in the story that Jesus includes that are key to the point that he makes. That's an obvious point that he makes that I don't think we can afford to miss when we're thinking about our vocation and what it looks like to hear well done in our work, whatever our work is. Talk to him really quickly. The first thing we see, I think, in this story is this. It is impossible to have a God-designed assignment that's insignificant. It's impossible to have a God-designed assignment that's insignificant. I don't know if you noticed this about the story, just in telling the story. In telling the story, which character does Jesus think we'll relate to in the story? Isn't that interesting? Maybe when we just think about our own jobs and compare our job next to somebody who does our job too, we're tempted to overestimate how important we are to the job and how much we bring to the table in our work next to the person who does the same work next to us. But when it comes to our vocation, when it comes to what God's doing in the world and what He's called us to be a part of in the world, most of us think we're one-bagger kind of people, don't we? I'm not a pastor. I'm not a missionary. I'm not even a celebrity or an athlete with a platform and influence over millions and millions of people that could use it for good in the world. I'm just a dad. I'm just a plumber. Just an attorney. Just a banker. Just a carpenter. Just an administrative assistant. I'm just a student. Just a retiree. 5 baggers, not me, in the story. Not when it comes to God's work in the world. 2 bagger, that's not me either. What's the smallest bag option? Is there like a 0.02 bag? No? All right, put me down as just a 1 bagger. In the scope of what Jesus is doing in the world, most of us believe that the piece that we've been entrusted with doesn't feel like a big piece at all. But you notice in Jesus' story, the smallest number option is still a really big number. I mean, can you imagine someone saying the words, it's just $1 million? That's pretty key to Jesus' point here. If you look at the work that God has called you to do in the world, even if it's just the work that He's called you to do in the world right now from here, and remember the story, they don't know when He's coming back. It may be work forever. It may be work for now. If you look at the work that God has called you to in the world and compare it to all of the other work that God has given others or through others in the world, and you decide that your assignment is insignificant, that it doesn't matter or won't matter to Him in the end, that's the first best way to get on the wrong side of this parable, isn't it? And ultimately to live a life of frustration, perhaps grief, and to find yourself on the outside looking in at the thing that God's doing in the world. It is impossible to have a God-designed assignment that's insignificant. Your work, wherever your work is, whatever your work is a really big deal, even if it's just 1 bag work. The second detail in the story you can't afford to miss, and it goes along with that. How do I know that my work is significant? Well, Jesus' assignment was entrusted, intentional, and individual. You see all of those things in the story. Jesus' assignment was entrusted, intentional, and individual. Just take one at a time. The word entrusted, it's right there in the story. He entrusted His wealth to them. That's a pretty big word. I mean, just think about your own wealth, whether you feel like you got a lot of wealth or just a little wealth. Who would you be willing to give the password to your bank account to? That's sort of a small list, isn't it? And that's just trusting someone with something, maybe allowing them to move stuff around between your accounts. Entrusting something is different. It means you give them the ability to sign for you, to make decisions on your behalf. If you're a financial planner that's been entrusted with $1 million, what does the master expect? Master expects that you're going to understand his heart, that you're going to understand his priorities, that you're going to understand what he's hoping to accomplish, and that you're going to use that grid in a way that governs the way that you invest what's been entrusted to you. Okay, play it out on a different vocation. Do it with architect, attorney, teacher, dad. He may not have entrusted to you bags of gold. It may be expertise, maybe education, maybe opportunity or interest or experience or skills that somehow came pre-wired within you. that he's entrusted to you to deploy towards the opportunities or the needs or the problems around you in the exact same way. Understanding his heart, understanding his priorities in the world, what he's ultimately going to accomplish, what you can contribute towards that today, and what he is and is not willing to risk along the way. What you have has been entrusted to you. That's a really big deal. We said last week, that doesn't just mean you go to work. The entrustment that you have and write John 3:16 on signature files on all your emails. It means the architect that designed buildings designs buildings that are efficient and functional and beautiful and innovative, because we know those are the kinds of things that reflect the work that our master is up to. It means attorneys that navigate issues of justice and truth and legality do it because we serve a God who's interested in those things. Dads, we see our kids as people who have been entrusted to us. And we're called to parent them in a way that tries to get as close as we possibly can to the heart and the priorities and the plan for God in parenting us as his children. Our assignment is an entrustment from Jesus. It matters how we use it every single day. The other two kind of things go together, intentional and individual. Those ideas show up in the passage as well. He gave to each one according to their ability. You see that? The investor, you notice that? He knew all three of the people that he made an entrustment within. He knew all three of the managers. He knew their capacity. He knew their limits. He knew their tendencies. He knew where they would put his money to work and how they would put his money to work. I mean, think about this. This is huge for some of us that struggle with insecurity in our work, insecurity in our jobs, wondering if we're really enough, imposter syndrome, or even shame, wondering if we could ever be enough or do enough to do the thing that we're called to do. Jesus is not surprised that someone wired exactly like you, with your bents and your passions and your talents and your liabilities and your strengths and your weakness and your education and your experience and your limitations, is showing up to your work tomorrow. He's not surprised that your kids are entrusted to you. And he is not wasting you in the work he's called you to. It's intentional and it's individual. Would you ever invest $1 million with a financial manager you didn't know anything about? Of course you wouldn't. And listen, Jesus hasn't done that with you. He's placed you in your job. It's not an accident that someone exactly like you is placed exactly where you're placed, with exactly what's been entrusted to you right this second. It's intentional and individual. And look, in the story, that's why the neglect is so personal. When the manager does return, and the one-bagger guy only has one bag to show, he hasn't done anything with it, the investor goes ballistic. Do you see why? It's not for financial reasons. He's not in any danger of missing meals because an eighth of his portfolio didn't get a return. The lack of investment was a vote of no confidence in the investor, saying essentially, you didn't know what you were doing when you invested that with me and you invested me here. Either way, whether you invested too much or you didn't invest enough, you didn't know what you were doing when you entrusted that to me, when you placed me in that spot with those things for these times. That's the last point. We'll talk about it. The way you invest your life, including your work, will reveal what you believe about Jesus. The way you invest your life, including your work, will reveal what you believe about Jesus. The investor intimately knew all of the managers, didn't he? But one of them hadn't bothered to get to know him. Instead, had built an inaccurate caricature of the master based on assumptions that he'd made and things that he'd heard from other people. He said, I know you're an angry, ruthless, hard, even unfair manager. When in reality, the manager's predisposition was joy. You see that in the story? How can you expect to understand God's assignment if you're not giving God your attention? How can you understand what he has for you if you won't get to know his heart? Notice this is huge. We misunderstand this parable if we think that the whole point of the parable is to say, Jesus has entrusted stuff to you, and you better do enough with it and accomplish enough with it to make him happy and keep him happy. That's not the posture of the master in the story. Do you see that? It's the inaccurate assessment of the unfaithful servant who doesn't understand the master's heart. The master is already happy in the parable. That's the invitation. Share in my joy. The master's joy isn't contingent on any way on the investment of the servants. The question isn't whether or not the work they do, the work you do, will make him happy or bring him joy. The question is whether or not you'll enter his joy or be entrusted with more. And the key to whether or not you will, the key to whether or not I will, is whether or not I do what I was intended to do when I was entrusted to do it as a part of his work, in my work, and through my work today. Both of the people who were faithful received the same reward and the same commendation. One of them handed the master a check for $10 million. One of them handed him a check for half that, or less than half that, $4 million. They both get the same commendation. They get the same invitation to the same joy and the same reward. Gosh, I wish we had the person in this story who'd invested 5 bags but only got a 10% return. Wish we had a person in the story that did all of his research, he'd been faithful and everything, made a wise investment on the money, but it just didn't work out because of circumstances outside of his control. Jesus doesn't include that guy in the story. You know why? Because that's not the point. The point isn't the return you receive. It's that you live your whole life towards him, even, and maybe especially, your work life towards him. Because you trust the one who trusted you with the talent he's entrusted to you today. In the economy of God, faithfulness is never a risk. So the question isn't what return do I have to achieve ultimately to hear well done from God in my work. That depends on factors outside of your control, outside of your knowledge. The question is, what does faithfulness look like today from here? How can I join God's work in the world in this for now? And then tomorrow, what does it look like to do that tomorrow? That's why we talk so much about next steps rather than finish lines at Doxology. I mean, you don't know what tomorrow will hold. You don't control outcomes. You don't know what's going to be required of you. You don't know what's going to be required from you tomorrow. You don't control outcomes or circumstances or stock markets or industry indexes, and you don't have to be in the perfect job because you're probably not in the perfect job to do all of the perfect things that you perfectly want to do with the perfect strategy and the perfect ideas and the perfect people around you to do all of the perfect things to make the world perfect. That's not your job. It's his. Even if you're not on a role like that. Maybe you're a stay-at-home parent. You're a middle manager. You're working a part-time job or 3, trying to make ends meet and put things together, and none of them feel eternal, but every single one of them is significant. Even while you wonder if your education and your expertise will ever be more than just a piece of paper on the wall, and if your hopes and dreams and plans for success will ever be more than frustrations. The one who designed you and is at work in the world today has placed you and commissioned you and called you to this for now. There is no higher calling that you could walk into tomorrow than that. There is no greater credential than you could carry than that. There is no promotion higher than that. And no greater confidence that you could walk into with tomorrow, wherever you'll walk tomorrow, than to be commissioned by the one and called by the one who owns everything, to represent his interests, reflect his heart through the everyday work you show up to tomorrow. Thomas Nelson's a pastor in Kansas City, author of a book, Work Matters. He says this: the magnum opus of most of our lives will not be seen under the bright lights of visibility, but will be the extraordinary impact of our ordinary day-to-day life, faithfully lived in extraordinary ways. It is in and through our vocations that the love of Christ shines bright, and the gospel is winsomely lived out and persuasively proclaimed, and where God desires our good work to be well done. It's where our Sunday faith and our Monday work meet. Would you bow your head with me? Lord, whatever our vocation is, would you let us live it that way? Would you let us live in an economy that knows that you're not waiting on us to make you happy, that you're happy in the finished work of Jesus on our behalf, and we get to live in it and enter into it and work from it as we anticipate your joy, even in our everyday work. Would you let us live and work that way and connect our worship to Monday, even as it overflows out of Sunday? We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Hey, thanks for watching. If something you heard resonated with you today, we would love to connect with you. Visit doxology.church/connect or leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed today's message and you want to see more, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new videos.